This presentation looks at the cause and cure of the crisis. We will be looking at the Great Stagflation since 1970 and a new synthesis for economic theory. I will be using two books, Definition and Reality in the General Theory of Political Economy, which appeared in 2000, and Common Sense, Boycott Holland, which appeared in 2012, and that collects my papers written since the crisis started in 2007. The summary is as follows. The current crisis is a phase in the Great Stagflation since 1970. Let us first understand this cause before we consider the cure. The events since 2007 cause economists and governments to focus on the financial sector, on monetary policy and national debt. This is reasonable to a large extent since the mess must be cleaned up and the financial sector needs regulation again. There are limits, however, to what can be achieved in this manner. It's also necessary to look at fiscal policy, at investments and labor. In these areas, the tendency exists to look back only a couple of decades, say to the period of President Clinton in 1993-2001, when the world economy seems to do well. We must look deeper, however, into the past, because the period of 1950 to 1970 contributed to the Great Stagflation that we are in. This presentation has 9 sections. First, we look at democracy and the model of trias politica and suggest a new idea of the economic Supreme Court. For taxation, there are 2 new ideas, the tax void and the dynamic marginal tax rate. For the economy, we look at 2 sectors, those exposed to the international world and those sheltered from it. These elements result into a shift of the Phillips curve, which is another way to express stagflation. And then we will look at the neoliberal answer to stagflation. Then the economic crisis from 2007 gives us reason to look at the USA and China and at the European Union and the Eurozone. And we close with a discussion of integrity in economic science and a reason to boycott Holland. Our model of democracy has checks and balances. We have 3 elements called the trias politica, with the legislative, the executive and judiciary branches, Parliament, President and Supreme Court. Within the political decision-making, the role of economists is important, especially since economics as a discipline has resulted in a lot of experience and theory. There has been an institutional framework for the influence of economic advice. For example, in America, there's the Council of Economic Advisors, of which the president is part of the cabinet of the president. In Holland, there was the Central Planning Bureau, and there are many other forms in other countries. Now, what's crucial is that the advice of economists is subordinate to the political process. This causes that there will be a lot of political influence on what actually is done with the advice, and also that the information can be manipulated. In that case, there is not a sound scientific foundation for economic policy, but it's guided by politics. And a way to improve that is to create a new tessera politica in which an economic Supreme Court becomes part of the political process. And in fact, the economic Supreme Court can decide to veto the budget if the information is not sound. The idea is that the economic Supreme Court has a scientific basis, is open to society and to science, bases its ideas and its decisions upon scientific consideration, and tries to stay out of politics except for the control of the quality of the information. Now, why would we want to make such a change? We can look at the economic records since 1900. World War I is probably started by Germany, and of course it had a weak democracy, so it's difficult to take that as an example. However, in the crash of 1929 and then the Great Depression, we had the new idea of Keynes in 1936 that could have made a difference, but he wasn't much listened to, and we got World War II. You can say that's also a weak case because of the developments in Nazi Germany. So let's take a look at the Great Stagflation, including the current crisis, and let us look at the climate and the environment as issues. Hence, there is my paper, A Constitutional Amendment for an Economic Supreme Court, written in 1996 and based upon earlier results, which has been updated in my book DRGTPE, page 279. This is my page at REPAC, and let's take a look at 1996, and there we find a constitutional amendment. And if we open it in a new window, then we can find the very article. It has been updated since then. This is my website. There is a video on how you can navigate here. Here we can find the English publications, also those on the current crisis. What's more important is that we have the book here, Definition and Reality. And you can download the PDF. I've done that already, so it's here. And we can go to page 279. And there we find the updated text of the constitutional amendment. On the page for DRGTPE, there's also a summary solution to the current unemployment in the OECD area of 1997. And here we find also the discussion of the tax void. Let's then indeed look at the tax void. We already saw it in 97. And there's an update in DRGTPE, and also in 2009 there's a article, a win-win measure out of the crisis. Now, if you look at DRGTPE page 43, we have an update of the article that we just looked at on the internet, and it discusses what went wrong in the period 1950 to 2005. In our analysis, we use heterogeneous labor and an earnings distribution. Then a cutoff by the minimum wage that creates unemployment. We decompose the minimum wage in subsistence and the tax burden. Then we analyze the tax void. We introduce differential indexation. We look at the dynamic marginal tax rates, and we look at the consequences for the macro model. This is the earnings distribution for heterogeneous labor. On the horizontal axis we have income, and on the vertical axis there is the million person years. And we can see that there's few people who have low productivity, we are few people who have high productivity. There's a sizable lump in the middle, and there's a asymmetry in terms of the productivity and earnings. Subsequently, we introduced the minimum wage, and in principle, those with a productivity less than the minimum wage will become unemployed. The minimum wage can be divided into subsistence and the tax. So this is the minimum wage, that's the subsistence, and this is the tax on the minimum wage. We can use a Bentham tax function, so that is earnings minus exemption, the marginal rate applied to that. And so we get net income given as earnings minus your taxes. Now we can find then basically if we have this your earnings must be bigger than subsistence. It's equal at minimum wage, thus we can calculate the value of the minimum wage. Notably, in Holland in 2002, the gross minimum wage was 15,000 and some. After deduction of taxes and premiums for the single person, there remained 12,000 and a half. Then when we add the premiums from the employer, then these are gross minimum wage costs, it's 18,000. And if we collect all taxes, so 18,000 minus the net income gives us almost 6,000. Then this tax difference, this wedge, is 45% as a percentage of net income. We can put it in the tax plot, where we again have the wages at the horizontal axis, and now on the vertical axis there's the tax. There's the 45-degree line, so that if you have a value here 35, you get a 35 there. We also have the subsistence line, which is a certain amount that you need to survive. This is your net income, and this is your tax. So below is your tax, and the above is your net income. So the intersection of the subsistence line and the tax line gives us the minimum wage at the same value, almost the 18,000 that we saw before. We can revisit the tax plots by shading the different areas. Darker is tax, the lighter area is net income. Here we see there are no earnings, so no taxes collected. And now normally this is called the tax wedge, but here at the minimum wage that tax wedge takes a different form because you can translate it to the horizontal axis, and then it becomes the tax void because we noted that there are no earnings here. If we combine the tax plot and the heterogeneous distribution, this is the right axis for the distribution and the left axis for the taxes, then we find here the benefit line, the tax line, the intersection, the minimum wage, and here this area, the tax wedge, can be translated also to a horizontal value, and this becomes the tax void, where people are supposed to pay taxes and they can't because they are in the minimum wage blockage, and therefore this is an area where people are unemployed because of the tax system in combination with the subsistence requirement and then the rising minimum wage. But also that since the government does not collect taxes in this area, the taxes can also be abolished. It won't cost anything, and then the people in this area can start earning the net minimum wage along this line and still have the decent income. Now this is an approach how the system could be repaired for the case of Holland in 2002. So we have here the original tax line, and if we have a 100% tariff here, then there will be no losses in taxation. Now a 100% tariff in this area might work, but it's not advisable to do that if it can be avoided. What we might do is insert a 75% tariff that links up here with the original line. And that means that in this gray area there will be some loss in taxation. Now, if this can be compensated by saved benefits in the welfare system for those who are unemployed in a tax void, then we have a sound financial approach. Now the question is, how can the tax void come about? It's kind of curious to have it. The first thing to note is that OECD countries adjust their taxes for inflation. The tax exemption in 2002 will be close to the inflation-adjusted rate in 1950. On the other hand, research in social psychology shows that subsistence tends to rise with the general level of income. So there's a differential indexation. In the 1950s, exemption was pretty close to subsistence, so there was no void to speak of. Since then, exemption has lagged behind the standard of living. And when tax exemption lags behind net subsistence, then there is a multiplier effect on gross subsistence with an accelerated increase in the tax void. And this process also explains the squeezing of income differentials in OECD countries. Let's look at the numbers. These are the indices for inflation 1950-100, 2600, and the wage index 100 to 2500. Exemption for a single person changed from 350 to 3000. It was pretty close to the price indexation up to 1997, but in the period since 2002, exemption was really raised and made a difference from price adjustments. However, if you look at wage adjustments from following the general level of wages, then exemption was still behind the indexation, and more importantly, it was really below the net income for minimum wage, which is 12,500. So if we look at inflation and the real wages, let me see here inflation for Holland and here the rise in real wages, and then stagnating for the period since 1980. So this kind of confirms that if we look back a few decades, it's not enough. We should look back at the period before 1980 as well. When we apply these indices to the minimum, then we find that indeed the real net minimum has been stagnating for the last 25 years. The real gross as well, inflation has been rising lately, and also the tax. Let's now look at dynamic marginal tax rate. The current approach to optimal taxation uses partial derivatives instead of total derivatives, and this neglects the dynamics of adjustment of tax rates. Now, here's the total differential that we should be using, and it consists of the partial differential that is used, plus of course the partial derivative to the tax parameters Q that also can change depending upon income. And we have seen this change of parameters in terms of the tax exemption that has been indexed on inflation rather than on income. Now let us assume that we index taxation, this is the relative change in tax, that we index this on income. Then we can exchange these and we get this expression, and this would be the dynamic marginal tax rate, and it would happen to be equal to the average tax. And this could be close to what we would want. However, of course, in the last decades, this hasn't really happened. So this would be something to look for in policy now. Just to be sure, here we have the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the Merrill-Rees Review, Reforming the Tax System for the 21st Century. And in this review, we don't find the tax void and we don't find the marginal tax rate, even though these were known since 1990, 1991. Now back to the slides. The focus of optimal taxation economists on partial rates instead of the total differential causes a shift from direct taxation to indirect taxation. It is from income tax to sales tax or VAT. This is a plot from the revenue shares of income tax and VAT in Holland from 1975 to 2000. And we see that the share of income tax is reduced and the share of VAT is increased. We see also a lower tax exemption or threshold in income taxation. We see tax creep. When we keep the rates the same, that means that the economic growth puts more people into the higher tax brackets. And when this happens, then people start complaining about marginal rates, which puts them into focus again. Now, the optimal solution would be set exemption at the level of the net minimum wage, index exemption on economic growth or the general rise of wages instead of inflation, put VAT at 1%. We don't really need it except for the cycle management of the conjuncture, and use also a gradual tax function rather than tax brackets. In 1983, Marijn van Schaik of the Central Planning Bureau analyzed the Dutch policy of general wage restraint. It was targeted at solving unemployment by means of exports, but at that period we saw both an export surplus and still unemployment at home. And his analysis was that the policy had too much restraint for the exposed sector with higher productivity and higher wages. So all this restraint meant it was really cheap to buy from Holland. And the policy had too little restraint for the sheltered sector that had lower productivity and lower wages. So their wages should have been reduced more. And the solution that Van Schaik proposed was to use taxes and subsidy to balance the wage cost. My extension to the analysis of Van Schaik was to introduce the minimum wage into the analysis. This was obvious in 1990 already, but it only resulted in 96 into a paper because then I had the programs to show that. And the paper was differential impacts of the minimum wage on exposed and sheltered sectors, which later was updated in the book and also resulted into a paper in 2009 on the crisis, with again a elaboration. If we look at the website of the book, then we find the papers on the relation to the world crisis, and then here the macroeconomic lesson, which is a PDF. Here we have it. Let us look at the Dutch export surplus. We see already a surplus in the beginning of the 70s, but then here there is the oil crisis, which also causes the Dutch natural gas to rise, and then the guilder to rise, which means that other exports are reduced. This is called the Dutch disease. There's the cure by means of wage restraint. Here's the Van Schaik paper where he explains that this doesn't work as much, and he is not much listened to. Here's the crisis where exports take a hit. When we look in the book on the paper, then we can see the use of the different production functions and consumption functions, the social welfare function, and then the graphs produced by the Mathematica program, and the result when the subsistence workers are allowed to work or are excluded by the minimum wage. And we can see the reproduction of the Van Schaik analysis. A key topic in macroeconomics is the shift of the Phillips curve. This curve gives the theoretical or statistical effects of unemployment on wage inflation or consumer price inflation. Now, the idea is that when there is a significant percentage unemployment, then workers will be hesitant to ask wage increases, and lower wages will mean lower prices. In the 1950s, we had a favorable combination of low unemployment and low inflation, and in the 80s, we had a very unfavorable combination of unemployment and inflation. And this is in fact the process of stagflation that we have been speaking about. In this picture for the USA, we will probably see now more unemployment and lower inflation, but it is already in the unfavorable area. For Holland, we have not only the same process where we move out from the 60s to the 80s, but there's also a large section that is not working and has been put into the benefit system of the welfare state. What is important is that in Holland also the minimum wage is much higher than the United States, so there will be a larger section removed from the workforce, partly into not working, but still this also means that the labor force has more chance to demand wage increases because there's less competition. There's also the empirical evidence that in the Phillips curve, the average tax rate is much more important than the marginal tax rate. This has been shown by Johan Graafland at CPB in 1990 in various regressions. So the analysis that we had before about the dynamic marginal tax rate confirms the analysis on the Phillips curve. In the book, DRGTP, there are more factors that explain the shift. So the match of demand and supply above the minimum wage may cause separate problems. This issue is discussed under crowding out on the labor market. Generally, the unemployment among the higher skilled is not large. And the analysis here is that crowding out on the labor market causes this effect. When potentially higher productive people face the choice between unemployment and a comparatively lower paying job, they choose the latter, notably when they are tired of waiting or when the benefit runs out. They therefore take the places of others, and those others repeat the process to others below them. This is a stylized version of how vacancies demand for higher incomes is larger than the supply, while the supply at lower levels of productivity is somewhat larger. It's stylized, but it explains the idea. This also means that if we succeed in getting the minimum wage closer to productivity, so reduce it by abolishing the tax void, then we have more guarantee that people working at the lower levels can defend themselves against the natural strength of the higher productivity workers. And this means more competition on the labor market and therefore a better control of the Phillips curve. Now we can ask, what is the empirical evidence since 1950 on stagflation? As we said, for the whole OECD area, in the 1950s we had low unemployment, low inflation, and high real growth. Now people will say that this is the period after the World War II, with Reconstruction, but it's important to point out to the economic laws where wages and productivity are matched. In the 1960s, we had a threat of unemployment, and governments started accommodating inflation in order to prevent it. In the 1970s, mass unemployment burst out in the open, and governments start accommodating high but also accelerating inflation to fight it. Growth has become volatile. We now understand what happened in the 60s and 70s. Because tax exemption was not indexed properly, government shifted from income tax to VAT, sales tax, and also a lot of welfare state arrangements were introduced with social security premiums, but those do not have a tax exemption and therefore directly affect the labor cost at the bottom of the labor market. The problem could have been solved by the methods discussed in this discussion, but apparently governments did not see that. And in the 1980s, we saw the rise of neoliberalism. This already started under President Carter, but was adopted much by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and then other governments in the world. Inflation was stopped with high levels of unemployment and also stagnating growth as the price for stability. Deregulation and liberalization of the economy was used as a motor for growth. Then from the 1990s till the crisis year 2007, it appears that Europe is reluctant to dress down the welfare state and accepts high minimum wages and more hidden unemployment in the welfare state, and the United States appears willing to accept more poverty. Then in 2007, the deregulation results into the implosion of the financial sector with the world economic crisis that we are in now. Please note that it is a modern fairy tale that Ronald Reagan in 1981 started a supply-side and neoliberal revolution with lower taxes and deregulation of markets. And the fairy tale is that economic growth since then derived not from Keynes but from Hayek. Alan Greenspan believed that fairy tale and supported the Reagan revolution with his low interest rate policy. It's a fairy tale because hard economic analysis causes these qualifications to it. The lower taxes also provide a stimulus, which is Keynesian. Lower rates of interest provide a stimulus, which is Keynesian. And deregulation releases funds that then scramble for investment opportunities. And investment is demand too. Thus we actually had Keynesian years. This is explained in this short paper and also in Common Sense Boycott Holland. Of course, it's a matter of definition what is demand side and supply side. So these things are rather subtle, and you have to look at what really happens in the economy. It's only to say that you should be very careful in taking ideological sides in this kind of analysis. When we return to the earlier review, then it's important to understand that in the period from 1980 to 2007, the financial deregulation and low interest caused huge flows of money chasing all kinds of investment opportunities, which means that if we want to have growth nowadays, without all those stimulants, we need to find other ways to generate investments and employment. Now, the other observation is that given the implosion, we also will see a return to stagflation because of the regulations are introduced again, which means that we fall back to the systems we had before that caused the stagflation. So we have had a very long period of repressed stagflation that now comes into the open again. In the last decades, there's a difference between Europe and the United States and China. Namely, in the USA, there's a world currency, the dollar, presumably not managed, while China has a managed float. The USA has been characterized by financial deregulation, while China still manages its financial sector. Of course, the high and low labor cost differential, the US low savings and a lot of consumption from loans, while China has high savings and consumers can't buy everything they want. And of course, the import deficit of America has been much facilitated by China, and the export surplus has been much facilitated by the USA. Now, as a consequence, the US Federal Reserve accepted a low rate of interest to finance the imports and home employment. And of course, this fuels the debt and the debt crisis. On the other hand, there is Europe. A monetary union without political and fiscal union runs against the theory of the optimal currency area. The monetary union rules, the Stability and Growth Pact rules, work out as a gold standard. That is, that governments have debt in currency that they don't have under control. These rules neglect that the export surplus of Germany and Holland mirrors the import deficit of the other countries. Now, these elements cause a lot of havoc in Europe. There has been censorship and abuse of power in Europe. For example, Bernard Connolly in The Rotten Heart of Europe, The Dirty War for Europe's Money, pointed out these elements. He was dismissed from the Bureau of the European Commission, which is a huge scandal. It can be useful to give a screenshot of the Wall Street Journal. And finally, when the financial crisis arrived, then Europe didn't have a banking union, so response was very disorganized. The solutions to these problems are that the new synthesis allows full employment with stable inflation, and countries like the United States and China can use that directly. Just to be sure, let's look at the book again. There you see the tax plot, the tax void plot, differential indexation, shift of the Phillips curve. This reviews the approach to stagflation. And this is the other book. Common Sense Boycott Holland has applications to the current crisis in the European Union with their monetary and financial aspects. There is the paper High Noon at the EU Corral, an economic plan for Europe, and our conditions for turning the ex-ante risk premium into a ex-post redemption for EU government debt. And what is not yet in Common Sense Boycott Holland is an amendment to the optimal currency area, and this was published in 2013. These papers can be found on my World Crisis page, though you must remember that the book contains updated versions, the High Noon paper, the Conditions paper, and the Money as Gold paper. In the Real World Economics Review in issue 64. So let's first take a look at the paper on money. It's important to realize that if we don't change some monetary arrangements in Europe, then things will go wrong. We either have to make a union which has political and fiscal union too, or we split up the euro. But there's a third alternative in this paper, and that is that each nation adopts a economic supreme court. The national court will monitor the national economy, but the courts of the different countries can work together, coordinate at a scientific level and not at a political level to provide the adequate information and the adequate vetoes if those are required. And the crucial thing is that the nation can appoint their own national scientists that they can trust, which would help to prevent sentiments of not trusting foreigners. Also, it's important to understand that money is only money, which is now not happening in Europe with this gold standard rules. The idea is that the primary payment system can be franchises of the European Central Bank. So if you put your salary in a bank, it would be as safe as with the central bank. We can also make a distinction between the savings and loans and then the investments banks, which could be different, and also be split up so that we have no banks that are too big to fail. Also, there can be created monetary funds out of thin air, and they can also be neutralized again by the capital requirements, which means that we will use money as other than gold. In the 1930s, with the Great Depression, we had a gold standard, and we learned that we shouldn't have that. Nowadays, we should make use of the fact that we can print money out of thin air and also neutralize them in bank capital requirements so that we have created sturdier banks and also at no cost. Now, the point is that countries in Europe will not want to bail out the banks of other countries. So the idea is that each nation in the Eurozone gets a proportional share in the funds that have been created. So there's not really a bailout, but there is a proportional advantage in the solution. And the other suggestion is that another 400 billion can be used to clean up the debt of Greece and Italy. You have to clean up the debt, otherwise those countries remain mired in problems. And the monetary solution is a clean fix. The participation of these countries in the Eurozone was a political decision, and thus we must bear the consequences. However, to satisfy the no bailout condition, it's suggested that Greece and Italy create economic zones comparable to the lease of Hong Kong, where companies can invest and operate under international law rather than be dependent upon governments of those countries that they have no experience with and that they are hesitant to trust. Let us take a look at the book. It contains some papers for a larger public, but also, importantly, the papers for the colleagues. Now, the High Noon paper proposes to have national investment banks to manage the economic cycle. If we don't do that, then we are stuck into high unemployment. Proposal is to have functional finance and not to be too afraid from deficits when they are related to investments and so on, for governments to create economic supreme courts and to change the European monetary system. The idea of the risk premium is that there's a distinction between the rate of discount and the rate of interest that a country pays. There's some confusion in the discussion on that. Now, for example, take a 5-year loan for 100 million or billion at a 2.25 interest for risk-free countries. And now let the risk premium from, say, Greece be 15.75%. They would have a bullet loan where they pay 18 every year, and that would be the interest payments, and at the end they will still have the debt of 100. The alternative view, however, is that the rate of discount should be 2.25, so that the remainder can be seen as redemption, and at the end of the period they still have a much lower debt. In Europe, the problem is that countries are left to themselves, and we need better regulation to impose the rate of discount to Europe or the Eurozone as a whole. And to do that would be to introduce a regulation ladder with different regime states. So if this is the debt to GDP ratio and this is the rate of interest, and this would be the future situation where a 100% debt to national income rate would cause a high penalty for a country, and this would be the normal range. However, we now have countries with a very high rate, so we need a bit laxer system to get them down to the normal range. So the ladder would have steps like stability around 60%, a warning phase when the ratio becomes higher than 80, a danger zone for higher than 85, and no more support from the central bank when the debt is higher than 90% of GDP. The possibility of an exit should not be considered because that causes speculation. So the idea is that countries would prevent to get into this situation. So the crucial idea is that we should make a distinction between the rate of discount for evaluating the value of a debt and the particular payments that are made by a government where the central bank should support a government that the surplus payments are regarded as redemption. This brings us to the end of the presentation. There is a case of integrity in economic science and a reason to boycott Holland. This synthesis for economic theory exists since 1990. The evidence in the period before already confirmed the theory. The evidence in the period between 1990 and 2007 confirms the theory too. See, for example, the Dutch export surplus or the export of unemployment that Holland has been doing in that period, and which was not needed and did not work because of the sheltered and exposed sectors problem that had already been pointed out by Van Schaik at the Central Planning Bureau. The theory, the synthesis, could have prevented the euro as it is now. The crisis since 2007 is also evidence for the theory. The publication has been blocked by the Directorate of the Central Planning Bureau It claims that the Bureau is a scientific institute with a special position within the Dutch government, but still a scientific institute, but that claim clearly is tainted. The Directorate neglects the evidence that I just pointed out. They also don't regard the crisis as of material value to this case, even though we know that export surpluses in the European Union are crucial. This presentation cannot show everything. Some aspects are still under censorship. Hopefully, the general outline already carries the floor. So, Dutch society does not solve the censorship. This is an experience since 1990. So my advice is to boycott Holland till it has solved this. On my website, please check out my weblog with the suggestion to boycott Holland, and this is the important page here. This concludes the presentation. Thank you for your attention. In case you are interested in some of my other results, please consider the list. I have not been speaking about ecological survival. That would be important. If you want to navigate my site, see this other presentation. Thank you.